When I think of my homeland, I think of rolling hills and olive trees. I think of Jaffa by the sea where my grandmother grew up. I think of its food, hummus, falafel, za'atar. Of its poets and writers like Mahmoud Darwish and Edward Said. And of its folk dance, the dabke. And I think of the old city in Jerusalem and of Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. What do you think of when you think of Palestine? What's the first thing that comes into your head? When you think of Palestine, do you think of its people? Do you see mothers, brothers, lovers, and friends, people like you and me? Or do you think of something else? Maybe you think of war, violence, and conflict. Maybe you don't think of anything at all. And I probably couldn't blame you. Palestine may dominate the news cycle every few years, but when was the last time you learned a Palestinian person's name, read their story, understood their experience? Dehumanization is what happens when we deny another person their full humanity. And it's what I want to talk to you about today, because we all have the ability to see others as less than human, and to do horrific things to people when we take their humanity away. Throughout history, those in power have always sought to dehumanize certain groups of people that they treated horribly. During slavery, African people were abused, exploited, treated as property that could be bought and sold, and forced to work in horrific conditions. And it was by portraying them as less than human that their white slave owners justified their horrific treatment and justified the very institution of slavery itself. In the lead up to the Holocaust, Jewish people were described as Untermensch, which literally means subhuman. They were vilified and likened to animals, making it easier to morally justify the unjustifiable, the mass slaughter of millions of human beings. This idea of certain groups of people being dangerous, savage, or barbaric, it's at the root of colonial logic too. Imperial powers like Britain, the United States, and France have always sought to portray indigenous people that they colonized as less than human. Take indigenous Americans, who were so deeply dehumanized by white settlers that the American Declaration of Independence itself spoke of them as merciless Indian savages. I want to show you how, for over a century, indigenous Palestinians haven't been portrayed as full human beings either. Whether by the British, who controlled Palestine between 1918 and 1948, or by the Zionist movement and the State of Israel. In 1969, then Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir famously said that there was no such thing as Palestinians. Now, Meir had lived in Palestine since the 1920s and interacted with many Palestinians along the way, well before the State of Israel came into existence. But by denying Palestinians their identity, Meir and the Zionist movement she led were trying to say that the Arabs of Palestine had no real claim to their land. Denying the Arabs of Palestine their roots in this way made it easier to justify the colonization of their land. After all, if you suggest that there's no one there, and that the people who are there don't have a real identity as such, then the land can be yours for the taking. But this erasure of indigenous Palestinians started even earlier in the 20th century with colonial Britain. The 1917 Balfour Declaration was a statement issued by the British that promised the Jewish people a homeland in Palestine. In the statement, Jewish communities seeking that homeland were explicitly referred to as the Jewish people, while Palestinians native to the very land in question were not even mentioned by name, only as the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. To be able to give away land that wasn't theirs in the first place, the British first had to remove all traces of that land's indigenous people. 100 years on from Balfour, and the consequences of a century of dehumanization of a people are playing out in Gaza as we speak. In the latest episode of horrific settler colonial violence, Israel cut off all water, food, and electricity to Gaza's 2.3 million people. Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant justified this measure by entirely erasing the humanity of Gaza's people. He said of Palestinians there, "We are dealing with human animals, and we will act accordingly. We will eliminate everything." And he stayed true to his promise. Much of Gaza has now been reduced to rubble. People are dying of forced starvation as we speak, including children and babies as young as 2 months old. The UN says that famine is now imminent for more than 1 million Palestinians in the north of Gaza. It quickly became clear that this was, in the words of UNICEF, a war on children. In just 100 days of war, Israel killed more than 10,000 children. That's 100 kids dying every single day. Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitteh, a British Palestinian surgeon who was volunteering in hospitals at the start of Israel's war on Gaza, explained why he thought that Israel could kill so many people. He said, "In order to be able to do inhumane things to people, you first need to dehumanize them. And in order to be able to kill 7,000 children, you need to unchild them. You need to create the rhetoric by which their lives don't matter, the same way that killing 7,000 children in London or Paris or Berlin matters." On the 26th of January, 2024, the International Court of Justice, the UN's highest court, ruled that Israel is plausibly committing genocide in Gaza. We have been witnessing a genocide being live-streamed to our phones, broadcast by brave journalists who have been documenting their own destruction for the world to see. People like Mu'taz Azaize, Bisan Ode, Plasya Al-Aqad, Mansour Shuman, Hind Khudari. Like Wa'il Dahdouh, who was broadcasting live on Al Jazeera when he learned that his wife, his son, his daughter, and his grandson had all been killed in an Israeli airstrike, and who later lost another son, Hamza. How could a genocide be taking place in broad daylight in the 21st century? I think it's because many people don't believe that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide at all. Because the dehumanization of Palestinians, both historically and today through mainstream media and political rhetoric, has left people genuinely believing that Palestinians deserve their suffering. We're in a moment of rupture, as you can see. What's been happening in Palestine in the last few months has had a profound impact on the relationships of millions of people around the world who live far away from Palestine. Calling for a ceasefire, daring to describe what's happening in Gaza as genocide, has ended lifelong friendships, lost people their jobs, and divided entire communities, including here in Ibiza. So, what can people do about it? How can we resist the dehumanization of others and instead make a world where the kinds of atrocities we're seeing today are simply no longer tolerated? I think we have to be honest with ourselves and start by examining our own internal racism and privilege, because the Western countries in which so many of us grew up were built upon the foundations of colonialism, slavery, and injustice. And we need to reckon with this reality, reckon with our privilege, and at whose expense we gained it. We don't exist in isolation from one another. The oppression of people who live far away from us, whether that's in Palestine, Sudan, the Congo, or Yemen, it impacts us too. And it's partly enabled by our privilege. So instead of seeing ourselves as somehow isolated or separate from others, maybe we can try to remember that we are all interconnected on this earth. And instead of turning away from other people and their suffering, maybe we can turn towards them to see ourselves in them and see them in us. When we bear witness in this way, we don't have to just see pain. We can also see beauty, the beauty of our shared humanity, the beauty of different cultures, countries, languages. And as we bear witness, we affirm the existence of those people and we resist their erasure. So, the next time that you dip your bread in some hummus or hear Arabic oud playing on a soundtrack, or see red hand-stitched embroidery on someone's dress, remember that there is another culture there. And behind that culture, a people and their entire history. Do you see them?